this is just like my notes
Oh.
as we think about sort of the work
You're
plan.
fine.
So, all right. Okay, welcome back after lunch to school construction aid working group. I'm gonna send everyone an email right now. Wanted to take just a few minutes, like 10 minutes, maybe less, to sort of think about now, like the trajectory of our work and how to think of sort of the chunks of it going forward. Let's see, I'm trying to find Megan's email to us so that I can reply all. So if I send it to
If
you,
you send it to me, I'll.
you can send it to everyone, okay, and include AOE and Beth.
Yeah.
All right, so we're all kind of swirling. There's a lot of complexity to the reality of how schools are organized in Vermont. We know there's a huge backlog. And we have a pretty big charge. So a week or so ago, Martine and I met to look at exactly our enabling legislation and all these things that we're supposed to decide and try to get our head around how we might tackle some of this. So coming from Megan to you right now is an email that just has our notes of trying to think about, we went through exactly what Beth walked us through in the last meeting. It was like A through N of the things that we're supposed to be deciding in our draft legislation. And so we went through each one of them and tried to think about what, let's see, do they have the? Yeah, the proposed work plan that I have before, is that in there? Everybody can see that? Okay. And so as we, and I talked with Jill and the team at AOE about this too, it seems like the sort of buckets of work, the buckets of decisions that we have to make are governance, and that isn't school district governance, which is its own messy thing, but governance of the school construction program, whatever it's going to be, if it's going to sit at AOE again, how that might look. The finance stuff, fancy words here, which is what do we, what does some of the fiscal modeling show us? JFO's going to be tasked with, what would some potential dedicated revenue sources be? And what are some of the treasurer's scenarios around bonding? There's some interesting or some slightly different things I think Rhode Island's doing related to bonding that that we may want to look at and consider. There's the calling it sort of political hard decisions part. I think we started to scratch the surface of this already a little bit, which is who's eligible and then how do we prioritize and what's kind of where's our North Star, where we're going here. If that means getting outside of existing boundaries that exist before the commission completes their work, how might we do that? And then the last bucket is sort of more technical. The assurance and certification piece. Again, these are all of these bullets listed under here are from the enabling legislation things that we were tasked with deciding. Most of the technical stuff, one giant exception being PCBs, most of the technical stuff may be pretty straightforward, and it may just be, the legislation says AOE, you shall create the planning guide, you shall define the renewable energy standards. A lot of that might not take up a whole lot of our time. Environmental hazards, and PCBs, I put a giant asterisk and that might fall more under political hard decisions. So we were trying to get our head around, okay, what's all the stuff we have to do here? If these are the sort of buckets of work, the piece that seems like we could maybe start to dabble with, and we were going to try to start to dabble here this afternoon, is the governance piece, the governance of a school construction program. Are we thinking about putting it back at AOE? STEM states have independent bodies. Jill referenced like the Green Mountain Care Board. What might that start to look like? I'm working with JFO to try to get more information so that hopefully in September we could start to look at more of the financial part, the fiscal modeling part. And then, order wise, I'm not sure it has to go in any particular order other than the political hard decisions. It might be better for us to have as much money info as possible before we think about the realities of what we're doing with that money. And the technical stuff might kind of plug in as it fits when we have things. Again, much of that I think is going to be pretty easy to draft. A lot of it's just going to be saying, okay, we do this. A couple little pieces of it might even be taken care of by the district quality standards. So that was our getting our heads around everything. Another thought is that in between meetings, if there are particular pieces that people really want to dig into, as long as we don't have a quorum, if people really wanted to look at something, that certainly could happen, like grant opportunities. You know, if somebody's interested in talking to our federal delegation, again, talking to USDA Rural Development, the Vermont Community Foundation, are there sort of things we haven't completely unearthed in terms of pockets of money, buckets of money? It may not change necessarily what we're going to write legislatively, but could be useful info. It falls under that sort of thing, people we may consult. So if there's any piece of this that anyone's particularly interested in or has some contacts or feels like, oh, I could probably have a meeting between now and then and give us some more insight, Senator Gulick and I are very open to that and appreciate if anybody wants to take that on or keep that in the back of your mind. You can always email all of us and say, well, here's a thought. So this is what we're looking at. So starting to dabble with some of the governance, and those might be some of the easier questions to answer this afternoon. I don't think we'll finish it, but it might put us in a position to actually make some decisions on that by September, then start to get into the finance part. And then we've got to figure out where we're going to start plugging the hard part, the eligibility, the incentives, what is the program that we're trying to stand up. So those were our thoughts around trying to synthesize what we need to do and how we might do it. Any feedback, thoughts, things people are particularly interested in digging into?
I definitely agree with you. I think the finance stuff literally in here, needs to come forward as quick as we can. You know? And start making those hard decisions down in number 3. We definitely need the money situation first.
Yep, okay.
My opinion.
Yeah, and then I just sort of put in parentheses kind of whose expertise each of those really, you know, we have to lean on for that. In many ways, I think the crux of the legislation we write, you know, Beth will help us with drafting that. It's going to be the eligibility, the incentives. Yeah.
State Board of Education seems to be a major player that's not yet really reflected in the kind of overview.
I think,
We need to hear from them.
yeah, I mean, I think we're going to get at that a bit as we talk about governance. Like when we say governance of the program, of the school construction aid program, if it sits at AOE, then I guess it depends which parts of it, but is that happening among some professional staff at AOE? Are we sending a lot more things to rulemaking? Are we tasking, what things are we tasking with the state board? So I think that's something for us to start wrestling with pretty quickly here in the governance realm. No. And other thoughts, feedback? Concerns, things you really want to take on as independent projects? Yeah.
Is it worth getting opinion from the V's, you know?
Yes, we also have an enormous list of like Ken should consult with, which can happen in a lot of ways. They're following, you know, I think certain interested parties are following this work. It's public. I want to make sure everybody knows where the website is, how to get to it and all of that. So you know, there may be some helpful information as we get further down the line from them, and we can call and people in to ask, and we can also have those conversations, you know, offline. Jeff Francis in particular has a lot of history around school construction and facilities. So, you know, I know I'll be talking to him at some point just to kind of bounce ideas off, but do you have any particular topics or questions?
Oh, I just wonder,
or perspectives?
just to get their perspective on the topic.
Yeah.
See if they've got any, you know, I wouldn't, I would limit the conversation to a, you know, time frame, but
Yeah.
I'm sure they have an opinion.
Yeah.
And just a reminder, you know, all of the V's were represented on the task force. So the task force report is very much representative, I think, of the consensus that was developed with them. My suggestion is that as we're working with the V's and also not just the associations, but with specific folks in the field, right? So there's the associations and then there's the superintendents or the business managers or the facilities managers that that do the work in the field and that we always try to collaborate really closely with them. My philosophy is like, let's check and make sure we're not going to break something before we move forward with it. My suggestion is that we have something to share and get the feedback.
Yep.
If we try to, I think we need like a concrete something for folks to react to so that we can move forward in the very sort of telescoped time frame. And I agree with you, Erin, as we're moving through, we're sort of having these back and forth conversations. I was going to, I don't know what talk about a sticky problem. The PCB and environmental hazards writ large, but PCBs specifically, I think I would appreciate very much if we could have a small group, of which I'm willing to be one, but really try like some thought partners, like really sit down and think about how we can incorporate, integrate, align the issue of PCBs in our schools in state construction aid. I have a growing sense that it's our path forward with that program. And I don't know if there's a couple of folks on the working group that would be willing to sort of crunch time, really sit down and really try to think our way through with real world examples. And we have a lot of them. And then maybe come back to this group and our partners and with sort of a proposal for how we integrate that. It feels like probably one of the stickiest parts of this. I've been grappling with it for several years now and have some ideas, but really could use some thought partners on this.
I'm willing to be one of the thought partners on PCBs.
Okay.
PCBs.
Just got a quick question.
It is, yeah,
It's gonna
it's,
suck it up.
Not being part of the educational
Yeah.
realm here, what are the V's?
oh, the Vs, are the Vermont Education Associations. They all happen to start with V because of Vermont. So the Vermont NEA, the Vermont School Boards Association, the Vermont Principals Association.
Very
So
short acronym. the
Each of the
V's.
associations for
Vs.
the school constituencies that all happen to start with B. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes.
I would also like to be on the P, but I don't think I have the time to commit right now. That's the problem.
I'm a little worried
I'm-
about that as well.
I would love to be, but right now, if somebody else would like to be there to talk about those, I'm
Yeah.
perfectly fine with that.
And are you interested? Senator Gulick may be willing to, and she's been pretty steeped in it in Burlington, but.
I'm interested, but I'm not gonna put my hand up yet.
Okay.
Need to kind of see where we're going.
Okay, all right. So that some of the conversations might continue kind of in the background because there's some really
Yeah.
real time with some schools, big decisions, big numbers, things being thrown around. So, and Chair Conlon, from House Ed is very closely following all that. He and I talk on that a lot. So I think he'll probably be in those conversations as well. It's his favorite topic.
Let's conversation.
All right, any other thoughts on, kind of buckets of work or things people might take on individually to get some more information or bring back some insight? If not, let's go ahead and move to, Jill's gonna lead us a bit through, we keep referencing Rhode Island, there's been materials shared. House Education and then Senate Education this past session have gotten quite a bit of information about their program. A lot of it has similarities to Vermont, except that it exists and has a lot of funding right now, so that's a huge difference. And we're not gonna take on the entire program, but there's some pieces of it, I think, that are interesting or attractive, focused particularly today on the governance of it, how they run the actual school construction program. We'll talk more about the finance and the numbers part of it, because there is some difference in some of the bonding that they are doing that might provide some ideas for us. So I'm gonna turn it over to Jill with an eye towards this meeting and the next, as we start to think about where, if we're gonna restart school construction, no matter how big or small it is, where the program might sit, how many people it would take, who's ultimately making the decisions, how we see that taking shape.
Great, thanks, Erin. And yes, so we have to sort of code switch here. We were talking about governance this
Yes.
morning in terms of, unified union school boards and like all of those things. So we're just gonna set that aside. That's not what we're talking about anymore. When we say governance, we mean the program itself, a state construction aid program. What is the structure of that, roles and responsibilities? There's this question, the prior program had a lot of involvement from the state board. Is that how we continue, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm absolutely going to borrow the homework of Rhode Island and the presentation that they gave. And if you have that presentation in front of you, we're really just going to look at slides 3 through 10, just to get sort of a brief overview of how they structured. If Cassandra was here, she would want me to point out that the reason that their program in some ways looks very similar to our original program is that there was sort of a chain of knowledge that went through several states and ended at Rhode Island. So we're now sort of coming full circle and reborrowing some of the work that they have done. So I don't know if Annie is on. If she is and can take pity on me and share screen, that would be amazing. But if not, I can make the attempt here.
Can you do it, Annie?
I just gave Bob the.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can.
All right, it's coming. Bob's on it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob. And I
Yes.
will absolutely, Bob, feel free to jump in. I'm sort of discussing because you and I are swimming in the waters a lot.
Oh, oh, oh.
Whoop, 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 whoop.
Okay.
And you share.
So while Bob is pulling that up, I think there's as Erin does, I think because we're both teachers and former teachers, we like to chunk things out so that they feel more manageable. So the way that I've been thinking about governance of this program is there's the folks who need to run a program. And we've talked about that, it was the Agency of Education. We had 2 staff members. Who is going to support the schools and school boards as they are looking at their projects, who is going to review those projects, who's going to provide technical expertise, and then who is going to really make recommendations about which projects they think should move forward, right? So those are what I would describe as the program staff. And we need to have a program staff if we're going to be investing state dollars. Then there is a question about who is actually going to recommend that state funds be committed. And this is a really nice graphic here from Rhode Island, right? So in the Rhode Island, first of all, they're a department, not an agency. So the RIDE, the Rhode Island Department of Education, sits under essentially their state board of education. Which is how the Agency of Education used to function, but now we are part of the executive. So their Rhode Island Department of Education is where the School Building Authority, which is the program, the actual staff that run it, is a subset, a team within their Department of Education. Separately, you can see there is a separate School Building Authority Advisory Board. And we'll see in sort of the next slide that is made up. It's a totally independent body. It is in no way tied to the Department of Education or the State Board of Education. It's a separate group of appointees and designees. And so we'll look at what the process is here. But in essence, their program folks are doing all of that kind of pre-work and review and approvals. They're going to recommend some projects that they're approving them. They're saying these are meeting all of our priorities. These are meeting our standards. They've done all the work. They make those recommendations to the School Building Authority Advisory Board. And then that School Building Advisory Board is ultimately who is going to recommend back to the state legislature, we need X amount of dollars to support these projects, and they're all prioritized. So there is a lot of similarities with our original program. And having this idea of a set of program staff and then a separate entity that actually makes the decisions. The difference is that in our original program, it was the State Board of Education that made those decisions. And in the Rhode Island program, it's an independent body. So I'm going to try to like surface decision points as we come to them. So decision point 1, where should the actual program staff sit? And as Erin said, should it sit in the Agency of Education? I have opinions about that. Should it sit as a separate entity? These are all, should it sit in the Agency of Administration or Buildings and General Services? That's a decision point, but we sort of also have to agree that we need that program staff. Second decision point is if we have a decision-making body about the funding itself, which projects should be prioritized for funding. Decision point is that the State Board of Education, as it was in the past, is an independent body, and we can look at what the makeup is in Rhode Island. So that's a decision point. And then what is the mechanism by which changes happen to the program? What is the mechanism by which specific priorities are incentivized? So as we look at the Rhode Island model, just sort of be thinking about these are decision points that we can discuss as we move through. Okay, Bob, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide. So the Board of Education, and remember this is Rhode Island, this is sort of their different roles and responsibilities. And remember there's, as Beth was saying this morning, there's statute, that's what you all do. And then there's rulemaking authority. That's generally in Vermont, that's what the state board does, with the exception of the district quality standards, which is a new rulemaking authority that the agency has. So you'll see in the list of roles and responsibilities here at the bottom is the Rhode Island School Construction Regulations. So they are making up those sort of rules and regulations. This is very similar to what we have. So things like, minimums and maximums, standards for educational spaces, et cetera, those still lie with the Rhode Island Board of Education. Bob, if you want to go to the next, and Bob, by the way, please feel free to jump in as I move through this. I want to give kind of a high level overview and then we can dig in and have conversations, but if I miss something, let me know. So in Rhode Island, there is an independent body. So this is where we differ from our original program, where the state board was the ones who were making those decisions about which projects, right, should be recommended for funding. In Rhode Island, the School Building Authority Advisory Board, that's a mouthful, consists of 7 members. So the treasurer, the director of the Department of Administration, so for us it would be the Agency of Administration, who serves as the chair, the chair of the Rhode Island Health and Educational Building Corporation. Bob, please correct me but I think that is the equivalent of our bond bank ?
I don't know the specific answer to that,
Okay.
Jill, but I can find out.
Okay, I saw that as well today and I thought, oh, I don't know who that person is. We'll track that down. And then 4 members of the public appointed by the governor, each of whom have expertise in education or construction, and then with some additional caveats there. So this is how they do it in Rhode Island. They have a separate advisory board, the team that sits within their Department of Education, does all the review, all the support. They approve a set of projects, and then they send those recommendations up to the advisory board. Bob, if you can go to next slide. This advisory board also has some other functions. The best use of the School Building Authority Capital Fund, which is a somewhat vague statement, but there's a lot of detail in that. The project priorities for the School Building Authority Capital Fund. In the case of Rhode Island, that is their incentive bonuses. So it's the program team within the Department of Education makes recommendations to the advisory board, but the advisory board actually sets what those bonus incentives might be. And they've changed them over time. So for example, they might, for 5 years, have an additional 5% incentive for projects that will support school safety and security. Fake example. And it's the advisory board that's going to determine what the length of time is, what that percentage of incentive is, and what those priorities might be. So they're able to, we've talked about this idea of like, what program are we building for? This is an area where we can actually build flexibility into our program. As we move from where we are now, our priorities might be really specific. We might really want to drive certain kinds of projects for the next 5 years because we've got some critical needs that we need to address. But 5 years from now, we might be sort of starting to look at different kinds of projects that we might want to incentivize. So there is, within statute, there's flexibility and adaptability built into the program. We don't need to sort of write every detail in because then we're constrained by that. So this is an area of flexibility, and they have shifted their program over the last 15 years. They also have the development of a formal enrollment projection model that may or may not be the decision point. You know, what are the roles and responsibilities that we want this group to take on? We always have to sort of, I think in Vermont, we always have to think about capacity and who makes up this group. I'm going to editorialize for a second. That is work that Bob is already doing for schools. So he's developed an enrollment projection model and he helps schools with this right now. So it might be the kind of thing that gets folded into the actual construction team. The determination of eligible cost components of projects for funding or reimbursement. Again, this was all stuff that was handled by the state board in the AOE previous program. The development of a long-term capital plan in accordance with needs and projected funding, collection and maintenance of data on all public school facilities in the state. That's already work that the AOE owns and is already doing. The recommendation of policies, rules, and regulations that move the state toward a pay-as-you-go funding system for school construction programs. Erin, I'm signaling as you work with JFO that this is a key difference. With the Rhode Island funding model, they have basically 3 different funding programs. And she may want to reach out to our Office of the Treasurer because they've looked at this and have opinions about that formulation. So I'm signaling something there. And then encouraging local education agencies. Again, LEAs here have a very specific meaning. Think of supervisory unions and supervisory districts when you hear LEA. To investigate opportunities for the maximum utilization of space in and around the district. I'll pause there for any questions. And again, I'm not the expert on this.
Yeah, this is probably a tough question. Do you happen to know what the budget is just for this advisory board? Any idea?
I don't. Bob, do you know that? We could find that out. That's a pretty simple.
I was just doing a little digging to see if I could find it, but
yeah. And it's all, I mean, so you can see, given the makeup though, Erin, this is going to be a part-time board, right? So this is additional work for their treasurer and their secretary of administration, and then these sort of 4 other folks. So it's something to consider.
Yep.
Okay. Bob, anything? Oh, no, Bob has nothing to add. We moved on to the next.
No, I
slide.
do,
Thanks,
I
Bob.
do. I just thought you were gonna say advance. I better know. Yeah, so, no, the only thing I was gonna add, Jill, well, your question was answered, Annie confirmed that Rhode Island Education Construction Division is actually equivalent to the bond bank.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. The second thing is, when it comes to the enrollments, I'm thinking, like, we had an earlier meeting and Martine had said she was on another group where they were doing a demographic study of Vermont, and Chittenden County was the only one showing growth in the projected future. That definitely has to inform, if we're gonna be talking future, maybe regionalization of schools, we have to not just understand school district enrollments, but what's the state looking like?
exactly.
And that might be a very great initiative to take for the group to try and at least push forward that idea that individual school projects are one thing, but the state visioning has to maybe look at state demographic shifts.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Bob. And we sort of started talking about this idea of like rural revitalization, and that's not just about schools, right? That becomes a much bigger conversation. So yeah, I think that you're raising a really good point there is the overall enrollment and demographic trends across the state. Okay, I'm going to move on so that we can get to the fun meaty part of our discussion. So the second entity is the School Building Authority, and that's what sits within the Department of Education. So this is what I would shorthand as the program team for my own sanity to understand what it is that they do. So this group is tasked with the management of the school construction program, with the goal of ensuring equitable and adequate school housing for all public school children in the state. Very confusingly, I'm going to signal that the Rhode Island program refers to education housing. Just so you know, as we move forward through this, it took me about a year to parse out what they meant there. They're going to review and make recommendations to the council on elementary and secondary education on construction applications for state school housing aid. So they are going to be reviewing the projects coming in. They'll be helping the schools. When you talk to the team from Rhode Island, a lot of what they're doing is being out in the field, talking to school boards, talking to communities. Our example of, you have one elementary school in a school district that has, 4 different towns, right? So this group might actually be on the ground having those conversations and helping this community to kind of come to a consensus. They're doing a lot of sort of boosterism, right? And sort of marketing of the program and its goals. And then they're going to be promulgating, managing, and maintaining school construction regulation standards and guidelines. In our parlance, I think of this as, right, we have statute, we have rules, and then we have guidance and standards. And so this group within the Department of Education is really creating the guidance and standards, the school construction guide, templates for ed specifications, trainings, et cetera, et cetera. Then they're also developing a pre-qualification and review process for prime contractors, architects, and engineers. At the start of their program, Rhode Island very much recognized that they had a lack of capacity in terms of vendors in the state. We face a very similar situation, and I would say we're exacerbated just given our location and our rurality. So they've developed a pre-qualification process. We had something similar in the past with our previous construction aid program. And it means that school boards are able to access this list of pre-qualified vendors with expertise in educational construction educational spaces. And that will, help to create some levels of quality and then also just streamlining the process.
Rachel, did you say that we had that in the old program? They had some degree of that?
Yeah, we did, working with BGS, and
And
it's
we're actually,
That was with our
part
tech
of-
center. That was with our tech centers, where we worked with BGS.
oh, okay, but I mean, there was also the pre-qualification of contractors that were looking to get on a list of eligible. Also, though, the master planning grant that we, right, that's also the pre-qualification of getting architectural engineers to be able to do the master planning grant as well. So all of it is just towards that idea that they go to a shopping list to pick from one who has capacity to do it, and they don't have to go out and do an RFP.
And calling out that the same act that created our working group and that master planning grant actually requires the AOE do that work this fall. So we're supposed to partner with BGS to start working on that, to develop basically a stable of well-qualified folks, potentially like within Vermont, but potentially from other states as well. It's also signaling to vendors that, we may be engaging in this work in the future. Because there's a lag time of, a couple of years is what Rhode Island experienced. Okay, in addition, the School Building Authority, so the program folks, are developing a project priority system based on the recommendations of their advisory board in accordance with school construction regulations for the School Building Authority Capital Fund. So they're looking at those prioritization criteria. Could be eligibility, could also be those bonus incentives. There's sort of 2 places that you can look at prioritization. And they're working with their advisory council on what those priorities will be. And there's sort of that list there. Bob, if you want to move on to the next slide.
Before you do.
Yeah.
So this project priority system in Rhode Island So we talked about what exists currently in Vermont statute. Can it be shared with us how Rhode Island approached this? Because it might provide some insights, it could be valuable.
Yeah, we
Yes, so-
definitely could do that, yeah.
yeah, and this is, it's actually, I think it's in this presentation, their prioritization, like what they call their bonus incentives, but I would say that's definitely a topic that we're all going to be digging into. We also developed, if you look at the task force report, we developed sort of a list of potential prioritization metrics. But one of our tasks is going to be, if we take that approach, do we have a base foundation, as they do in Rhode Island? So they have, no matter what school district you are, what your project may be, there's a base percent state share if your project is approved. I believe, Bob, please correct me, but I also think that they include some sort of poverty metric in that. So maybe a wealthier community might have something like a 10% base share, but a higher poverty community might have like a 20% base share, and then you start stacking on the incentives. So we can talk about the mechanics of that in a subsequent meeting. I think there's some real meat there, and we'll definitely share it out ahead of time. Okay. Bob, anything else on this, or we can advance to the next slide?
Okay.
Okay, and then finally, and I think this is probably the bulk of what they do, is they're going to be providing technical assistance and guidance to school districts on the school construction application process. They also have a bit of a two-step. Again, it shouldn't surprise us. They've sort of inherited some of the Vermont program over the years. So there's sort of like an initial approval and then a final approval. They're going to provide technical advice, assistance, and trainings to schools and to contractors. And they're encouraging schools to investigate opportunities for the maximum utilization of space in and around the district. And we've really seen in Rhode Island, they're very open about the fact that they have taken a philosophy and an approach of newer and fewer. That's a decision point for us, right? Is that our main goal here, or do we have other goals that we want to address? And so as part of that, they've talked a lot about how they're really out in districts, really having these, what are challenging conversations with communities about the ways that they can maximize the space, but also, I would say they take a very sort of forward-looking, this is what you get when you do this, when you consolidate from 3 schools to 1, this is how your students will benefit, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot of that, like facilitation and sort of marketing, I would say that's a major part of their work. All right, and Bob, if you want to go next slide. And then this is their, again, this is their program team. So this is what it looks like within their Department of Education. I'm going to opine that given the nature and complexity of what we're facing within our current education system, that our previous program of 2 wonderful people is probably not adequate to the need. So I will signal that just given my on the ground understanding of the needs of our schools right now. So the Rhode Island program has a director, that's Mario, who has presented several times. Then they have a school construction coordinator and architectural design reviewer. Then they have 3 education facility planners, architect design reviewers, and then they have a finance officer. They are housed within their finance division. Within the agency or within the Department of Education. If we did want to house within the Agency of Education, we could sort of discuss, but I think, that the decision point is really just where does it lie? I think, Bob, that was it in terms of governance in this slide deck.
That's right.
Okay, so if you want to stop sharing, I think, Erin, if there's no questions on the Rhode Island program, I think we can sort of open up the conversation.
Yeah, I think we were hoping to start to get people's initial thoughts about where this might sit for Vermont, what it might entail. I know you have to run. I don't know if there's anything else you want to share before you go.
I need to digest.
Okay.
I'll get back to it.
Great.
Thank you. I do apologize.
Yeah, no, this is the challenging part of these working group things.
Well done.
They're not on anybody's schedule in our regular schedules, but they take a lot of time.
I think I can start off by just saying, obviously there's concerns on, the budget, like we were just
Yeah.
saying, what the budget for the advisors, what they have set up.
Yeah.
And what the cost would be, add all these FTEs. It's gonna play a factor.
Yep. Do people have initial thoughts about, I think the first sort of either or is, does it sit somewhere in AOE? Or are we envisioning something different elsewhere, separate?
I think the first, I mean, I agree. I have trouble supporting an advisory board, just in terms of the cost.
Yeah.
I'd rather put that money towards the school districts for school construction instead of paying to set up a bureaucratic entity. And I'm just looking in terms of what would we recommend to beef up our current agency of education in terms of having more than one or two folks working with our school districts and working with our architects and just working with the overall system. And maybe look at that structure. It's going to be a lot cheaper to put that up in place than having an authority. I'm also trying to figure out, do we keep separate some of the roles now that we have to the Agency of Education? But the real nuts and bolts of it's with the State Board of Education. It's kind of like the State Board of Education is equivalent to what Rhode Island is doing with their in-house authority.
With the advisory board or with the?
Well, it's the
actual-
advisory board. Our state board is really doing more what their advisory board would be doing.
Mhm.
And what do we need to tweak? With what Bob went through this morning, what do we need to tweak to really make it work better? Or be more responsive to what direction we really want to go? And then when I look at, what Rhode Island is, they gave a foundation amount of money, and I'm thinking to myself, how could we even do that within the constraints of our budget? And then one thing that's rattling around in my brain, I don't know if we have other opportunities for other funding from other sources. But would there be any opportunities to develop a revolving loan fund on the state level? You need to have some money to initially feed that. And then it would be a revolving loan fund. And we did this thinking of the poverty level of schools. We did this for our drinking water projects, where we had sliding scales of what you could pay for years. And if you were -3, it was almost equivalent to a 40% grant, something. And I'm just kind of wondering, is there any way, maybe for some of the funding that goes to school construction could be done on a revolving loan fund basis where the state puts in the seed money, and then the districts could borrow from that at an interest rate based on their poverty level or wealth, and pay that back, so you got the money revolving. It's gonna take an initial chunk of money to put in there, but at least, and I don't know how that would play out with the ed funding system, how that all plays out with that. I don't know if you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. I'm just trying to figure out structures that have been put in place previously.
If I go back to, I see the benefits of having a standalone kind of authority like Rhode Island does, but I also see the benefits of having it housed within AOE. And I also know how AOE is strapped right now. So obviously, if that were to happen, we would still be looking at quite a few I don't know if it'd be the 6 or 7 that we have here, but we definitely would need much more staffing in AOE to handle this regardless.
Yeah.
So it's kind of. Thoughts, Bob?
So
This is
if I
a
can,
lot of undertaking here, obviously. I was curious, obviously, these are full-time positions we're looking at from Rhode Island.
Mhm.
And we don't want to have this in Vermont, obviously. When we talk about seed money, we talk about the program stopping for a moratorium is put on because there was no money. And I go back to Chris's, okay, so how much money are we looking at and where does that come
Right.
from? And because everything else we talk about here, really, I'm moving set up a
So, you know,
program, but if it's not working or not ready to be implemented, then what have we accomplished if we don't have those monies? So in my mind, unfortunately, it all goes back to the money. That's okay. What do we have for seed money here and where do we start and how do we implement that?
so what we've looked at in the past, because this is the first time we've looked at how do we fund a school construction? It comes down to about three to four sources. Do it through the ed fund, which currently we're doing it by default through the ed fund. Do it bonding through the capital budget, which we only bond about 54 million per year for all state projects and water and dollars going back to our communities for water and sewer projects. Do you do a targeted revenue source for school construction specific? And then the new piece that kind of has been floating around for the past year or two, which is based a little bit on the Rhode Island model, where you go out, the state goes out for a total separate bond
Right.
of $100 or $200 million. But that's going to have some big impacts with our debt affordability. Those are the folks that look at our bonding capacity as a full state and our rating capacity, and they work with our rating agencies to figure out what can we in the state take on as debt.
And honestly, that amount of money is a drop in the bucket of what's actually needed for school construction too.
Well,
That's the other factor.
Right, the capital budget is, but
Right.
there's other items.
Right.
You know, we have full faith and credit responsibility for a lot of other bonds that go out there. And then we also have moral obligation for other bonds that are going out there, like when UVM or state college systems go out to bond, we have a moral obligation as a state to back up those bonds. It's not full faith and credit, but all of that plays into the rating agencies and what they do with our credit rating. So if we want to put out $100 or $200 million bond all at once to pay for school construction, that's going to have a big impact. And the treasurer might have a little different opinion on that. We don't know. But those are the four sources, really, at this point.
And a different revenue source would need to be a stable revenue source, you know, and in my opinion, it can have huge fluctuations and.
Yeah, would it be surcharge on the income tax? Would it be a sales tax? Would it be a corporate tax? Would it be rooms and meals? Cigarette tax, alcohol tax? You're looking at a tax,
You're using that 3-letter word.
but that's what it comes down to. I mean, that's always been the stumbling block. If you have a targeted revenue source, it's a tax. You gotta tax something to get the revenue.
And this, you know, that's some of the, I'm meeting with JFO at 3 today to set up, you know, kind of the information and work for us for September. Obviously, none of this is just falling out of the sky like, you know, like magic here. I think the other reality that we have to keep remembering, I can go back to the memo from AOE and find it here, but you know, as you keep saying, Rep. Emmons, it's in our ed fund right now. It's all on property taxes right now. And it's hyper local. And so it's, you know, it's places that can afford to bonding. It's places that can't, maybe throwing good money after bad again and again and again and patching things that shouldn't be patched and keeping open buildings that shouldn't still be open. And it's in the ed fund that we all, you know, again, that's a statewide fund. There is a cost there too. And we can get maybe more clear information from JFO about it. But I know I kept trying like back of the envelope to add up as we were in, you know, pretty miserable place last winter with school budgets and seeing where we were headed. How much of this is facilities spending And what do we have any idea what we're spending on? And I have to go back to find the numbers, but you know, it's a lot, and it's gonna continue to be a lot. Facilities, you've got to maintain them. But I think I feel, you know, it's a little bit of a misrepresentation to feel like there isn't already a tax to pay for that. It is happening.
Property tax.
It's property taxes, and it's also, I worry about how it's being spent in a way that's, you know, sort of emergency. It's, you know, making like when you make the bad decision because you only have bad choices. And some of it we have old buildings like we're just not gonna get out of that. However, could an office of 2, 3, 4 people at AOE that had eyes and ears on the ground, that knew, you know, your boiler's running out here, this enrollment's going up, this is going down. Is it possible that you might even break even of what you're spending on a few professional state staff and spending in facilities around the state that is really ill-advised? And again, you've got school boards. I was a school board member myself. I was ill-equipped oftentimes to be making the decisions you are about facility spending. And I was fortunate to be in a larger district where we had a professional, you know, facilities manager, and I saw, you know, the ability to see across the system and make decisions. But there's a lot of places that's not the reality of how they're, you know, how they're doing things. And when the rubber meets the road, you try to fund the teacher and keep the classrooms open, and you spend the money there and not on the facilities. But the cost of that is just snowballing for us. I guess I see we're spending on it more, whether we realize it or not. And I worry we're spending money that could be spent better. And we're not going to fix it overnight and flip that switch. But I personally see a benefit of a much more professionalized small division at the Agency of Education that's really focused on this, like they used to be, you know, like Jill and Bob are sort of doing now. That is going out and, you know, has eyes and ears on the ground, that is doing that work. I'm much more interested in seeing that kind of governance of it than, say, another independent kind of body or board, because it would cost way less, but it still costs something. And then you're paying people per diems, and you're like, I'd rather have dedicated state, you know, those are good jobs too, like dedicated people. I'd rather be building for an AOE. We gutted our AOE, you know, 15 years ago. And we've been paying that price for a long time as well. The more local control is expensive. You know, are we in a place where we need to start to have a little bit more centralized resources and authority? If we're going to have a centralized education fund, and we're a tiny state, and we're probably going to have to do things on a more centralized level to be able to afford them in the long run. But that may be pie in the sky, but that's, I would say, how I am seeing things.
I guess one of the questions I would have for the group, or whoever engages in the discussion, if we find the TAX word abhorrent, right? And we know we can't bond over a certain amount without causing a problem for our bond rating, how do you envision the schools looking next year, the year after, the year after? It's a known problem. We have a problem with some generating revenue. That doesn't excuse not dealing with the reality that Milton may not start because they have a mold issue.
Yes, like that's.
Newport Elementary has a leaky roof from day one on the new roof, and now they're trying to do an emergency roof, right? The reality is, all these things are happening while we discuss the theory of how we're going to deal with the problem. And they have to open the schools, so they have to spend that money on a bad investment because they have to survive. So if we're not going to boldly face the challenge of generating a dedicated revenue, it almost makes the facilities assessment be immaterial to the whole initiative. We have found out that we have a big problem, and we've quantified it just to get us out of the hole, not even to surpass and become modern 21st century. So if we don't want to find a solution to it, this is just going to perpetuate. We're going to have the discussion for the ensuing 10 years, the ensuing 20 years. And buildings are going to fail, become uninhabitable, and it will cause consolidation through building failure, not through any wise decisions on our part, or not my part, but as I speak.
Absolutely.
Okay, what we're seeing right now is a result of 16 years of no oversight. Because when the moratorium came in place, there went your oversight. So schools could be doing construction on their own, like what you were saying, and we don't know if it's good construction or not. We have no oversight for the past 16 years. And a lot of schools deferred it with the hope that the state's gonna come in and rescue them with state money.
And it's hard to quantify that dollar amount that's been kind of thrown away.
Yeah,
Going back to the whole governance of it, I think I would lean towards what Rep. Brady was saying and lean more towards housing this in the AOE myself. I think it'd be more palatable for everybody, to know that we're housing it in the AOE and not creating a whole nother governance system. And I think it makes sense.
it's cheaper.
Makes
Yeah.
sense. And
It's cheaper. I mean, you're gonna hire 2 or 3 more people instead of setting up a whole new bureaucratic entity. And, you know, if you've already got a couple people, you need 1 or 2 more on top of
Yeah.
that.
I would also make the argument for the Agency of Education owning this program, that ultimately we do want educational considerations when
Yeah.
we're thinking about major renovation or and if you have it exist elsewhere, there's a strong risk that it becomes purely a financial program, purely a funding program, and that you're losing the expertise, the subject matter expertise of not just, say, the 3 to 4 people within the agency who do construction, but also all of that expertise of all of the other folks within the agency, our connection with the Department of Health, with the Department of Environmental Conservation. Bob reaches out to BGS all the time, right? They do buildings all the time, you know, so we're losing access to that bigger picture if it becomes a separate independent entity. One decision point I think that we do need to think about, though, is again, so if, let's hypothetically, just so we have a concrete scenario to work with, let's say that we did have a team of 3 to 4 within the Agency of Education that became our state construction aid program. Decision point is that group setting the priorities for what will be incentivized? I would actually argue the answer to that should be no. I think there should be an independent body. I don't know who that is making those choices. I like this idea that Rhode Island has this separate entity that can flex and change the program over time. I think it gives us that adaptability that we're going to need long term. And so I don't know, there's a question mark here. I don't know that as it currently exists. This would have to be, I think we need Beth to say, does the agency actually have the authority to make those determinations around things like bonus incentives and that sort of thing if those change over time? But I think also just the sort of known political realities, it does seem to make sense to me that this program team would do the reviewing, would set priorities, and then would make recommendations to some sort of other body that would then ultimately make the appropriation request from the legislature each year. I think it absorbs, it creates a layer of sort of buffer around that program team so that they are not impacted by sort of political winds and they're just doing that core program work. So I think there's a question there. In Rhode Island, that entity is that advisory board, and they're a part-time board. In our previous program, it was the State Board of Education, which is also a part-time board. So that, I think that's a decision point. It's a discussion point.
So that's what's rattling around in my brain. When I read the Rhode Island model last month, whenever, I think we already had some of this already in place, be it with the Agency of Ed, the program, and then the nuts and bolts with the State Board of Education. And I'm thinking, why aren't we still using those 2 models? And I don't know what the issues are. I'm not in the education world, So I don't know what the issues are with the State Board of Education. I don't know what the issues are with the Agency of Ed. But it seems, an outsider looking in, we already have those two entities as check and balance on each other. And why would we not use the State Board of Education for that second piece? Jill, as you just said, why won't we not already use that? I don't know, naive in terms of what's happening there and all the dynamics. But I really wouldn't want to create something new and pay for something like that when we already have something in place. I mean, that's where I'm coming from. I want to put our limited dollars to our school districts to help our schools. I don't want to build up the bureaucracy to make the program. We already got something that we could use in place.
Well, have we made it past the first decision point?
Well, so yeah, I guess so. Maybe
I just
we're,
assumed a hypothetical, Chris.
Wait, no, absolutely no. And I appreciate that because you made complete sense of what you're saying. So I mean, it's, yeah.
there seems to be some mild consensus, I wouldn't say unanimous, that I'm hearing that we are feeling like the program itself sits somewhere within AOE, whether that's 1, 2, or 100 people. It's not gonna be 100 people, but you know, if that's a couple people. That, you know, sort of professional staff reviewing applications. Hopefully some boots on the ground at times, looking at things. There, I don't know if, again, I'm not necessarily unanimous, but it sounds like at least 3 of us sitting here right
Now
now.
invest some money somewhere.
That,
Put people, put boots on the ground
yeah,
to
that
administer this.
we're thinking that kind of program authority level would be within the existing agency of education.
So, might I ask the question?
Yeah.
Just evidently it appears that there may or may not have been a mistake made. Past Rep. Emmons said this is her second moratorium since she's been here. My question is, okay, if we move forward and set this up, we've struck twice already here. We didn't see that coming. What happened? How do we prevent that in the future from happening?
Yeah, we gotta.
So we got to learn from our mistakes here. So what do we do to prevent that from happening?
Well, I think that's the funding aspect.
That's the funding aspect. Where are you
Oh,
going?
you didn't see it coming?
We saw it coming. We saw it coming, and then that's why we just knew we couldn't dig our, what triggered it? What really triggered us going in the hole was a variety of things that happened over the years. Paying 100% for our tech ed buildings. They were originally 2 or 3 million. Then we ended up having 3 projects that were over 18 million. 14, 16, 18, 20 million, and we were paying 100% of that. So then we backed off on that 100%, so we're paying 50%. We had the biomass thing pop in because everybody wanted to shift away from fossil fuels. We said to incentivize them, we're going to pay 90%. And that started to tank because a lot of schools came on board to do that. And then we kept our 30% in place. Then we tried to have districts and buildings consolidated, and we did those at 50%. So we had all these different percentages to incentivize our schools to operate in a certain way and make some certain decisions, and that's what tanked us.
I think that's gonna be the really, really important part of this is the incentives and how the percentages that we're actually gonna be willing as a state or able to as a state.
To meet those obligations.
Right, that's gonna be what really makes or breaks the program, in my opinion. Obviously, we have to have the right governance system and we have to, but it's really gonna be the funding aspect of it and how we prioritize.
Or the prioritization. So like what you're saying, Jill, is that, so if your office at the agency does the initial review, helps with like the technical aspects, the application, the planning, then wherever those go, to the state board, to some other authority we create, to the House Committee on Education, wherever those go, then if you have 100 projects that have merit past all the things, who's gonna actually pick the 7?
Well, you gotta have the priorities.
Can I
Yeah.
raise a question and maybe a comment as well? So Rep. Emmons, I could use your historical knowledge here. When those different prioritizations were made, so the 100% for CTEs, the 90% for biofuel, the 50% for consolidation, and I think only 1, maybe 2 schools actually took us up in the consolidation because it was a different time.
Yep.
Who was making those changes? Who was responsible? Because I think that's actually critical to this governance discussion, right? Because I think that we could look, understanding this idea of creating additional bureaucracy, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the appealing, here's my comment part of this. One of the appealing things to me about that advisory council is that that is where those sort of bonus incentives, which are really what we're talking about, the 90% for biofuel, et cetera, where those decisions are being made, we could have a conversation about who is appropriate to sit on that council that might keep focus. Because what you're describing to me is like new ideas bubbled up and people got really excited and maybe sort of lost the plot a little bit about what are our goals for this program? How are we defining success? And then keeping a laser focus on that. That might be the state board, but I think we would need to put those guardrails around what success looks like. And that maybe needs to be in statute, so that we are not losing focus by the newest shiny thing and that we all know where we're going. So I don't know if you can provide any.
I can.
Yeah. I saw the giggle.
Yeah, well, with the tech centers, those were originally first built back around the 60s. And at that point, the schools, because you were kind of, for a tech center was more than just that host school. There were other communities. The students could go to that tech center. So the state paid 100% construction. Usually it was a wing off the high school or a couple wings off of the high school. And that was done through the 60s and early 70s. Around that time, I mean, you were talking pretty minimal dollars to add a couple wings to a high school. But because there were other towns that would access, they knew they wouldn't be able to get all those towns to throw money in at it. So the state say, we'll pay 100%. Well, come the late 90s, mid to the late 90s, those buildings, wings were 25 years old, needed upgrade. So, hey, you paid 100% before, so we continued. And there was some that were like 2 or 3 million. And then all of a sudden, these career centers started coming up. There was Hannaford's down in Middlebury. There was one up in Newport. There was Essex. There was one in Springfield. They were running at 14 million to 24 million. We were going, wait a minute, we can't absorb all of this. So that put some pressure on school construction. So that was one of the big pieces. The 50% consolidation came out of a conference committee with a capital bill with institutions. That's where that came out of, because there were some senators, there was consolidation in their districts. So that's where the 50% came from. The biomass came from the environmental groups wanting folks to get off of fossil fuel. So they said, well, we can look at school construction and provide 90% cost. We'll pick up 90% of that cost for that district, or boom. But those districts are saving more money than what they put in, or even our 90% by making that shift. Then the performance contracts, that came in on the heels of that, with the environmental group really wanting help to pay for the energy performance contracts. So it was really a hodgepodge, depending what the politics were in the building and depending who sat on those conference committees and who sat on those respective committees. The 30% never changed.
Yeah.
But it was all the other additions based politically who was where and what was on out unit.
Sounds about right.
So it sounds like
that's
the
what
word
tanked us.
strategic got lost in that
Right.
mix. I think that raises a really important governance question, right? I think we're getting to something, which is who is the body that is going to determine what those incentives are? Are they going to change over time? And I think we have consensus, I'm going to suggest here, that whatever those priorities are, they need to align to a strategic vision for education that hopefully, fingers crossed, is going to be coming out of the Education Commission, right? So we need, our timing is not great here. But we need to ensure that alignment so that we don't get distracted by, it's not even saying these aren't good priorities. They're just priorities that we can't afford to, we can't afford to do everything, right? And we're gonna have to pick what our most important things are. I would tend to argue that improving our students' outcomes and ensuring that they're in safe, healthy environments might be in our laundry list of things that we really want to do. But given our financial constraints, that might be the things that we need to focus on. I mean, those are the conversations that we'll get into. But that conversation about who is going to be determining what those priorities are, what is the base funding? Are we shifting bonus incentives over time? That to me is a governance question. And I think we can learn lessons from the past, right? We can learn. I think we all understand.
We should
the
learn
political
lessons from-
realities.
Keep it out of the political arena if you can.
I would agree. I would agree. And
And
so
maybe it's-
I would argue that it shouldn't necessarily sit with the legislative body and it shouldn't sit with the executive. That's where I do think an independent council might be important.
So I'm gonna suggest in terms of our ability to concentrate here, it sounds like we are, I think we would need to revisit it the next meeting, but we're maybe inching towards likely the sort of program work would sit at AOE, a lot to be figured out in terms of what that, how much capacity is needed, what that might take. And I think this leaves us all with something to really think about in terms of the second level of the priority part, how to keep it from being political, how to learn from the past, how to keep it realistic. And then maybe that is a conversation and discussion we could take up kind of early next time as people have time to chew on that and think about it a bit. And then again, going to try to get some more sort of financial modeling and ideas queued up for us as an information source for next time. And I'm going to ask JFO too, if there's any way they can help us conceptualize the sort of on, what's not quantified right now, just being in everybody's local budgets, being in, in the ed fund. It's not as if we aren't spending on facilities and construction, nor are we going to be able to stop. And school buildings have to be open. Hopefully they could be like safe and nice but they have to be open. And so, doing nothing, is really not an option entirely, how grandiose certainly is, but we have to have functioning schools.
And I think the real priority at this point, and I'm only speaking for myself, is really figuring where the program's gonna sit.
Yeah.
How that plays out, what is going to be the role of the Board of Education?
Yeah.
I think we really have to figure that out. And if we do have this neutral entity to really figure out how you do the bonuses. But I think the other piece that I think we really need to make sure gets put in place is that facility planning.
Yes.
The manager. I mean, that to me is so important. We wanted to do that back in the 2000s because you can't have your maintenance person at the school do this.
Yeah.
You really need that. And that will help us as we go forward here. Because maybe if we get some of that structure in place, the funding's going to take a lot of time because everybody falls into their category of, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want this. And somehow if you're going to fund, you cannot do it with bonding through the capital bill.
Yeah.
You might get 1 or 2 million a year.
That's
That's the reality of it. You can't do it that way. So it's got to be something, and that's going to be the hard nut to crack.
Yep.
But if we can start getting some of the structure in place, but that gets people's hopes up too, but at least you know what's up.
Other thoughts on, where we're leaving things today and some of the governance pieces that we're starting to hash out here? Anybody wants to make sure? I know, Beth, you heard much of our conversation.
I wonder if it's worth, like you wanted somebody mentioned bringing in the Bs, and it was mentioned, well, that would be better once you have something down on paper. I'm assuming, Beth, you're kind of working up on maybe some proposed legislation based on what we're talking about, or is it too premature?
I was actually going to ask the same thing. I was going to ask Aaron and Beth, if between now and our next meeting, if we could work on drafting like a proposed sort of governance section, that then could be reacted to. I'm worried about the folks who aren't still in the room here
Yep.
today, but we need to, I agree,
Yep.
like this actually feels like probably one of the easier parts of this conversation, and so we want to get a win, and
Yeah.
get that
Yep.
momentum. And if we could work on maybe drafting up a section. And I'm also, I'm Beth, willing to help on that, just so you know.
We all say it should stay in AOE. I mean, I certainly don't have a problem with that,
Yeah.
but what does that look like is my question. Okay, are they staffed appropriately right now to say we want to create all these other things here, or part-time, full-time, whatever else? I mean, is that still more positioned within
I think that
education?
I think that we could, between Bob and I and working with the interim secretary, we could probably put together what that looks like. We're not talking about 10 positions, right? We're just, that's neither the reality nor I don't think it's strictly necessary. So I think that we could probably sit down and scope out what would be I'm going to say appropriately resourced program
Yep.
that will be successful. I think that's not too hard. Frankly, Bob and I have been talking about this for over a year. So I have a plan in my back pocket.
Yeah.
And we could scope out the budget for it.
Sure. Okay.
You're gonna
That
have
sounds
a
great.
treasurer in this time too.
That's the goal. We're working
Yeah,
on getting
hopefully.
that,
Yeah.
getting that secured, but that is the goal.
Mm.
So.
You know, one thing that goes through my mind, I don't know if this would help
Yeah.
committee members at all, but I remember what we used to get in institutions committee, the recommended priority list from the State Board of Education, and how we had to work with that list to figure out how we were gonna, what they were recommending, and knowing when the projects were gonna go to bond, if they'd already bonded, just the cash flow of that. I don't know if seeing an old list like that would help in understanding how the cash moved through. I don't know if that would help folks or make it worse, but if you saw, I pulled out an old one, but it's
Yeah.
not complete
Yeah.
in terms of how we did, but JFO might have an example of that from way back, just to see how it was structured, so you can see fiscal year by fiscal year what would be required. And those are old dollars, but at least it puts out a structure there. I don't know if that would help or not. That's been going through my mind a little bit.
Be open to seeing something like that for sure.
Because it really, you could see what schools were ready, it already had one payment and were due for another, where they had just gone to a bond vote and when the projected time, and it played in with the fiscal year and what the state share was and what the total amount was that we were needing to owe. The dollars are old. I have to multiply them by 10 times. But
So as a starting point,
Yeah.
or at least something to talk about, right? So if we're acknowledging that the facility assessment, although highly inaccurate in terms of actually pinpointing the numbers, right? But we've been talking about between 300 and 400 million a year.
Yeah.
If we did a 30%, if the state did 30%, that's 90 million on the 300, right?
Mhm.
Which means that the local schools have to be bonding the difference.
Right.
right,
So,
which comes out of your ed fund when they pay back the bond.
right. But I mean, these are the type of numbers that have to be being talked about in reality. If we're gonna have JFO do some sort of modeling.
Yeah.
Anything short of that, we are just
No, we have to
We're
look
not
at-
doing
kicking the can down the road. And what we're saying is, shame on you because you deferred maintenance, right? And so we can't not invest and then say, shame on you, deferred maintenance. We have to somehow help that out, right?
That's why I'm kind of rattling around a revolving loan fund to help on some of this. But that plays into your ed fund and how all that's interconnected, but at a lower interest.
That's 300 million though, that number is that to just, that's not to get us back, get us,
No, that's just to
Flush,
fix
that's
stuff
just
that broke and get it repaired
right,
or replaced.
right.
But it has nothing to do with 21st century learning that we say we want. It doesn't do with any new additional spaces for STEM or STEAM. The whole list goes on. All we're doing is fixing a broken jalopy.
At 300.
Feed into the governance in terms of the operational governance.
Right, I'm just,
This
Yes.
was-
I'm just trying to, because you hear so many numbers, you hear so many plans, but from what I remember, the $300 was still creating a snowball effect. $300 million is still creating a snowball effect.
Yeah,
Right?
if we don't invest substantially, yes,
Right.
and we can go through the math real easy now, right? If we have 300 this year and we only put in 30, 270 gets added on to the next year's
Right.
300. Now we're up to 570. We throw in 30, now we have 540 adding on to the 300.
Right.
Now we're up to 840, right? Within 4 or 5 years, you're over $1 billion. So
Can I offer something? Sorry, Bob, I'm behind you. So I'm a voice from the back of you. So I think there's different things that we can contemplate, and I think that it's worthwhile, Aaron, when you're talking to the JFO folks, Rhode Island is a nice model for us. And I think it's a good one to start from. Even within their program, they have different kinds of programs.
Yeah.
And Bob and I have talked to, I don't know, a dozen other states at this point. There are some states, they don't support, and I actually don't recommend this, I'm just throwing it out there, that they don't support big construction. What the state kicks in is basically money for maintenance and repairs. And so we could contemplate a universe where we have, say, part of our program is a bonding program. It's sort of like the big dollars, and Treasury has done some of this work for us that would support specifically, you know, the big renovations to increase ed programming, or those newer and fewer types of programs, or turning a rural school into a community school with a medical clinic, right? So those bigger ticket types of programs or projects. We could also at the same time contemplate something like that revolving loan fund, or a fake, totally hypothetical penny on the tax type of program that generates, say, $6 million a year or something like that, that could then be used for the schools that are not going to do major projects, but might need some smaller repairs, right? Or might need that replacement roof, right? We don't want to bond necessarily to replace a roof or to replace an HVAC in a school, but maybe we have a separate kind of revolving program that has lower barriers to access, that is never going to dig us out of that $300 million hole. One of the things we determined in the task force conversation is we are not trying to dig ourselves out of a $300 million a year hole, because that would mean that we are supporting our existing footprint. And one of our sort of points of consensus is that as we're contemplating the future of our education system, it is likely not 400 schools. Right, that it is not necessarily a sustainable education system on a whole host of issues. So I don't think we're trying to bond $300 million a year to do repairs and maintenance and just dig ourselves out of the hole, but we do need to support schools that are going to continue to need to exist for at least some period of time, that have real needs for repairs, because we do have 16 years of deferred maintenance. So Aaron, I think what I'm saying is, as you're talking to JFO, let's contemplate the whole universe of what we can do. Let's be creative and flexible and a bit bold here. What are the different ways that we could generate revenue for potentially different purposes? Some of which might be short-term, some of which might be longer-term strategic goals.
I wonder, I'm just thinking out loud, Jill, I wonder if there's any value in us talking with Nicole Lee at AOE, as she was zeroing in on school budgets more and more, just to give us any kind of sense of the amount of facility spending. I don't know if this is helpful or not, but within existing school budgets, and I know that that's a kind of broad category, but I think she'd started to break down budgets more so that we could compare.
Bob, you've tried to do a bit of this work, right? With both Nicole and I think maybe with Ted Gates as well. There's like the budget side and the expenditure side.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they have, right. They
Yeah, I don't know if it's useful, but
No, I think all that would be useful. In fact, we're sending out a questionnaire to VASBO, to the school districts to help us understand what our operations and maintenance budget value. Because that would be very
so
helpful.
I think even if it's just very brief, but kind of snapshot and may not be perfect, but again, keeping in mind, we are spending something now. We're not gonna be able to
Mhm.
stop spending that, but yeah, that
Yep,
just might be good as we're getting into numbers.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right,
So when are we meeting? I know we had a doodle poll.
so we had a doodle poll and we had Friday, September 27th down.
Is that
However, we just found out yesterday, I think that JFO might not be available that date.
Oh, I didn't need them.
So that I'm meeting with JFO at 3 and I will talk with Julia in person. So we might have to flip back to one of the other dates, which I think then it would be the 18th. So the 19th, there are potential listen and learn conflicts. There's LCAR meeting. There's, I think, too many conflicting things. So we may have to flip flop back to September 18th, but I'm gonna be meeting with JFO in 10 minutes here, so
We really need.
so Megan will send a follow-up email.
Everybody except you.
This
The
week.
18th.
The 18th would work, so I'm gonna, yeah. The trick for me is school is starting and it's really hard to get out of the
Right, I
classroom.
know.
First weeks of school, so there's a chance that, I might have to catch parts of it. I can do parts of it in study hall and stuff, but during my teaching mods, I may not be live, but if Martine can chair it, then we might just go with the 18th.
Part of the JFO ask, I think, was to also see what the economic driver for reinvigorated
Yeah.
school construction
Yep.
does for the state.
Yep.
What jobs is it creating, hotel and lodging, sort of,
Right, there's
as contractors are moving, coming
Our
in.
contractors, yeah,
Yeah. So,
the materials and the whole.
and you're right, the suppliers, all that.
So watch your email for final confirmation, but we might have to be flipping back to September 8th. And I don't think we have any public comment. Does anybody? Okay, so no public comment that we need to tend to. Other thoughts, questions, or things people want to put out there before we wrap for today?
So that answers that question.
You don't have something?
Yeah, Erin, I was just gonna say, I think, in terms of like the part of our brief that's around sort of other funding sources and that sort of
Yes.
thing.
Yeah,
I feel very confident that AOE staff can pull together information on the very limited US Department of Education funds that are available. We can do, see what's out there in terms of the bipartisan infrastructure investment acts.
yeah.
It's been, we know what's there currently. I don't know what's coming. And we've got already really nice information on the USDA Rural Development Loan Program, which we really should talk about how we can leverage that. It's
Yes.
a very nice program
Absolutely.
for our schools, and it's something we can actually sort of make that request of the federal delegation, right? If you want to
Yep.
help, this is a really concrete thing you can do.
Yeah.
So I think the AOE team could take those pieces on. I think as we're diving in deeper, it would be great if someone has interest or capacity to look at other programs. If we're thinking about sort of multi-purpose school buildings, or what do you do with a school building? If it needs to be closed, how could it benefit the community? Getting an understanding of what those, housing program, community development programs, like I don't actually know the scope of that universe, and sort of having that, I think, all together would be really helpful. So I don't know if there's a partner on the committee that might already have some insight on that.
I know some of the older schools, like Waterbury did this, Barry did this, and I think there's another town that's doing this. They've converted those into either senior housing. And maybe some affordable housing.
Is that a VHIP thing where they would do?
I don't know where they got all, I mean, some of this has been done 10, 15, 20 years ago, so I don't, housing authority, they're looking at housing authority, or it could also be a housing trust, like Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust, those certain, but, old school buildings are tough.
Yes, I know. So
They're
they
really
they can be
tough.
hard to repurpose.
That in Milton with the old elementary school is turned into senior living.
Yeah,
It's currently still made use for that.
right, and that to me is the most logical, because it's already been done.
It's an asset for the town already, so why not reuse it for?
Right, and they're usually in a location that's pretty decent,
Right.
usually.
Yes. I will commit to trying to meet with Sarah Waring, who's the USDA, the Director of USDA Rural Development for Vermont, New Hampshire, and she was at the Community Foundation before that. I know she has extensive knowledge of some of the kind of rural development community funding sources, and the Winooski did a huge renovation on the existing footprint. House Ed toured it. They qualified for quite a bit of USDA money. How rural gets defined gets super tricky, but again, this is where we need to lean on our federal delegation,
Right.
particularly senior members while they're still there.
1 and 2,
Yeah,
1.5.
so I will see what I can unearth from Sarah Waring. If someone else, I'll see if Martine has any housing world kind of contacts that she might want to pursue.
Yeah, Sarah's such a great resource
Yes.
and I mean, I feel like if Winooski got defined as rural.
I know,
Yeah, really, really.
I know, yeah.
Questioning that
rural.
anybody in
Yeah.
Vermont wouldn't be defined as rural.
Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of wondering too, would there be any opportunity with any municipalities that are trying to go into a TIF district if there is a school possibly within a TIF district? I mean, that's a whole different ball of wax, but some of these schools are located closer to a downtown in some towns.
I'll ask somebody in my house if he has any ideas.
Yeah,
We
we
should
should
test it at the
know
municipal
somebody.
level.
You know,
I
somebody.
have a resource.
We'll see.
Because they do a lot, a
I
TIF
know.
district, there's a lot.
Yeah,
It's the thought.
okay. We will leave it there for today. You'll get an email by the end of the week from Megan confirming the 19th if it's gonna be that, or sorry, if it's gonna be the 18th.